One of the reasons I kind of brought us down here, you know, so many times you were talking about, like you just said just now, like wanting to know like what this place looked like in terms of Tilbury, and also I think so many people in terms of our community and who we grew up with, or who I grew up with, or who were friends and things of our family, have came across either like this way through different places into the UK, coming from the Caribbean, from so many islands that we know, Jamaica, Trinidad, Grenada, Barbados, all these different places. So I wanted to start here because it was like, I think that's a kind of a moment to touch on, for us to touch on.
Yeah.
Because
it's the beginning for a lot of them.
For a lot of them and for us as well, because I know, was it when we so many times you talk about like first coming to the UK, and you're talking about like what that was like, do you know what I mean? Like coming from Barbados for that first time.
Yeah.
So what was that like? Like, I mean, you tell me so many times, you know, that first time you saw snow and, you know, of your aunt and uncle meeting you when you first came here, like, what was that like?
Yeah. Well, I came by aircraft, of course, by Luxembourg, and of course I came in January of 79, no winter clothes, because of course coming from the tropics, there was no way to buy winter clothes, and I came via Luxembourg.
Did you try to buy winter clothes?
No.
No, I didn't think so.
If there was an option, you probably would have, because you know it would have been cold in England.
Yeah.
Like the people you see coming off the boat, there was no option, so you just wear your normal stuff.
Yeah.
And went via Luxembourg. The flight came in the morning, so I had all day before connecting flight to London. So on the way over, I remember seeing all this, the ground just looked white. And I was looking at it, and I thought, oh, I can't stand it anymore, I've got to ask somebody. So I touched a passenger that was, you know, sitting next to me, and I said, what's that down there? Why is it so white down there? And they just looked at me and just smiled. And they said, that's snow. I said, oh, the only thing I'm saying, snow is on the TV, on black and white TV, so it had no correlation to what I thought it would look like. So Luxembourg, I went outside and I just looked at it. Well, it wasn't snow, it was ice on the ground. And I just stood there looking at it. My mind just boggled. I just couldn't work out. It was big lumps of ice on the ground. So that was my first experience with, you know, with frozen snow here. So.
But I could just imagine though, like, you know, coming from Barbados, obviously the warmth and the heat, do you know what I mean? Like, but that's all you feel is warmth and heat.
Yeah, I was wearing clogs. I remember that.
You were in clogs?
I was wearing
okay,
clogs,
you said you couldn't find winter clothes, but you can find clogs in Barbados.
Clogs is a tropical thing.
Oh, okay.
You know,
that's a new one. I did not know that.
Yeah, well, I did, yeah.
Okay.
So it was original. Anyway, the flight left the night, and my husband and my uncle and aunt met me at the airport with a coat because it was winter, so they know that I wouldn't have had any winter gear. And my aunt put the coat on me, and it just felt like it weighed a ton. I'd never had anything that heavy on before. So I put on my coat and we left the airport. That was the beginning of my journey here in London. Yeah.
But that's the thing, isn't it? Like, I always think there's something about like the weight of things, you know what I mean? Like cold and what that means in terms of weight, like you got to insulate yourself. And coming from somewhere like Barbados, when the warmth and everything is just like, you don't have to put like the additional layers on to like protect yourself or insulate yourself. And I was just wondering, like, I don't know, like when you, that kind of environment kind of thing as well. So it's just like coming from Barbados, like you were telling me, obviously, you know, you can't buy winter clothes, it's the Caribbean, it's permanently warm. Yeah. So what is the Caribbean like, you know, and you remember like kind of growing up, especially because you were there before Barbados got independence in the 1960s. So can you remember like what that, you know, what that time was like coming up? Because I always remember Granny when she, you know, Granny would say like about, you know, like the darkness, like you've got nothing to fear from the dark, but the idea that, you know, you don't have like lamps, you don't have street lights, like the darkness is a natural kind of night, and that, you know, when you're walking through, you know, when you're walking through cane fields and when you're walking down the paths and stuff, that darkness, that heaviness is like right there, but it's a cloak and it's something that you're comfortable in, you know what I mean? It's a part of like the world that you live in, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that was probably more into Mum's time because, again, a lot of people were still working in cane fields and plantations and stuff.
Yeah.
So she would have had that experience living we're different to where we grew up.
Yeah.
You know, so she would have been carrying maybe food and things to Gran, you know, who worked on the plantation and stuff there still at that period of time and so on. For us, of course, it was different because Well, then we were living in the housing area. The government had built new homes, so we had all the amenities, water and all the usual amenities and new builds and stuff like that. So that's how where it came up. So that wasn't an issue. We had electricity and everything. Occasional time you might have, the power might go, and you still always kept the trusty kerosene lamp for emergencies. But more often than not, the electricity worked pretty good and so on like that. Yeah. And independence, I was quite young when independence happened. To me, it didn't mean very much to me at that time. I was about 10 when it happened. So I remember just getting a new outfit for independence. We didn't go into the city or any of the festivities. My mum had to work. And I just remember her making new outfits for all of us, and taking us down to Sandy Lane, because at that time she used to look after the kids of the manager of Sandy Lane Hotel back in the day. And she just gave us all new outfits, and we went down there and we had a picnic with her.
I can imagine
she was looking after, all dressed up.
I can imagine it's like church day, isn't it? You know what I mean? All frilled, all their hair's done and everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we were quite young then, so it was she made the shift, a yellow shift with the white lace and the little blue velvet bow, with the flag colours, national colours and so on. But as you said, we were quite young, so it didn't mean that much to us. We were too young to know the difference about it, until we got much older and stuff like that. Yeah.
What about for me, so I think one of the things that's been absolutely a gift, and I say it so many times, in so many different ways, not just in terms of, being able to be an artist and talking about these stories, whether it's in your work, whether it's in people like we are today, but I also think it's the way in which that growing up within two worlds, what that feels like and what that what that emotionally feels like, how that becomes part of your identity and things as well, and how much you and Dad were so strong in us being rooted that it was home to us. And when I think of Barbados, when I'm thinking of home in that context, I think of the beaches, I think of the coral reefs, I think of the gullies and things. I think of when you go down the East Coast, when you think of the surfers and when it's rough and you've got those Atlantic seas. I think of, the West Coast, where now obviously it's so much of it is just all hotels, but there's all these kind of aspects of to me that I think of Barbados, and part of that kind of identity is so much to do with the environment and the sea. And I just wouldn't for you, when you talk about your feeling and your relationship with the sea.
Yeah. It was always a strong thing with me, and me and one of my other sisters, whenever we had any free time, we always went to the beach. So that correlation between the sea has always been quite strong for me, and looking at things on the sea, watching back in the day when we were kids growing up, then we would, if you got bad weather, you would get sea urchins being washed up on the beach and seashells being washed on the beach. From earlier, I would collect shells and stuff like that there, and the sea urchin shells, the different ones. They're the spiky black sea urchins with a very long thorns and there were the small ones, the white ones, where the prickles come off, and you used to use them and paint them in watercolors and stuff like that. And when the black coral and so on, or bits of coral, which usually come off when the weather is very bad, it breaks off with the action of the sea, and we would collect bits of coral and carry them home and stuff like that there, so on. So the sea was always a big part of my life. Whenever I had spare time, I headed to the beach, and that's how I also met your dad. Going to the beach as well. I met him there. But I've noticed, as you said, going backward and forward, and also with you guys, because living here in England, I wanted you all to have that strong connection with Barbados, because my thoughts were that you're living here and you're exposed to everything here. But in Barbados, because we live a long way away, you're less exposed. So my thoughts was, I want to take you all back there pretty often, so that it'll become as familiar to you all as being in England. And
you say that though, but we grew up in such a big Caribbean community that sometimes I think, although we grew up in London in the UK, it was like we grew up in a mini Caribbean, because there was everyone from every island, you know what I mean? Whenever we'd go to cricket and stuff, you've got everyone's from Jamaica, Grenada, you know what I mean, Antigua, all over the place.
People that we never met. And,
people that we never would have met. And all the different food that comes with that. I'm thinking so many people that grew up with from Guyana, you know what I mean, which I always think of that extension in terms of the Caribbean going into South America and stuff, so many Guyanese people that we grew up with and stuff, and the music and the kind of like, well, the cussing that goes with it in different ways, in different languages, and different
people carry their culture with them. So the point about the Caribbean people is that we are here, but we bring in part of our culture with us. Cricket is...
You know, and you came and you say, like, you know, everything was kind of like, you have these pristine kind of images of like lawns and gardens, and I can imagine the most kind of, I don't know, like manicured kind of, you know, I think of like kind of like Victorian England, basically.
Yeah, basically. And as you hear, people say that they used to advertise that, the streets were paved with gold, more or less. Not literally, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There's lots of things to achieve. Otherwise, in the mother country, because that's what was known as the mother country, So when you came here, streets were pretty pristine as such, but, it's just changed your whole view, because before you know what something looks like, you make a picture in your head visually. Mm-hmm. So then when you come, then the reality replaces that picture, that preconceived picture that you had.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Because I wondered, like, we were talking about when you were saying like the first time you see ice and everything, and I'm just thinking, when we were talking about Barbados, for example, like it's just so much colour, and there's so much like everything is like bombastic and vibrant. Do you know what I mean? Even the mosquitoes bite you hard. Do you know what I mean? Or like, you know what I mean? The rum gets you, or whatever it is. Like all the different things about life is so bright. You go to church and everyone's like, whether it's lace and gloves and colour and like satin and everything else, everything is so bright and vivid, and the heat is strong. The water is the water's warm but lush and sensual, and all these different kinds of things. Yeah. And I was just thinking, before you were talking about like the coral and the sea urchins and the different types of sea urchins and that would turn up on the beach, and I just wondered, like, what was that feeling when you would see the sea? Like, what was that kind of resonated, that kind of linked you when you have that feeling when you're in the beach or when you're there?
But at home, the beach was always a place of calm and peace, and just nature itself in its, one of its rawest state. So it was beautiful, but also terrifying, if you know what I mean. Yeah. But I spent a lot of time, all of my life, at being part of the sea. So when I came here, I told my husband, I would like to go to the beach, and I said, well, how far is it to the sea? Because I feel like I still needed to have that connection with the water somehow. So, Maragret, the nearest beach from here is at least 50 miles away. So I said, okay, and I want to see this beach. So it took me, and that Brighton was the first beach that I went to. And I remember seeing it for the first time, and I was thinking, okay, this is it. First I was looking at all the pebbles on the ground, and I thinking, okay, this is weird, because I've never seen a beach that just had only rocks, basically, as we say. The sand, even the sand, when you did get to the sand, it was quite rough, quite coarse. Unlike our sand that could be quite blinding sometimes. It's so white and so fine. Yeah. But okay, it's different. And the water, of course, was icy. But a bit later, I heard about, I think it was mentioned at one cricket about Maragret. Yeah. So there's me and my best friend, Andrew, who's also from Barbados. We didn't drive at the time. So we decided to get the train and go to Maragret. And you all were quite small then when we went. So that's what we did. And we thought, okay, so at least there's sand. So this is more our sort of thing. We can sit down.
This feels like home. This feels like home in some kind of way.
But it's the next best thing
to home. Right, okay. The surrogate space of like, the surrogate place of home.
Yeah, exactly. So we took you all there when you were quite young. Quite often we just get the train and we go and spend a day at the beach and so on, And then when my sister visit from Germany, again, we went back down again and spent the day on the beach, because that's like normal to us, if you've got a celebration or something, you just want to be by the seaside, especially in the summer when the weather is nice. Yeah. I don't know, like so much of what a place is and how it becomes like your heritage and things, and I think so much of that is so much like how you live it and then how your family live it and relive it and relive it. So, and I'm thinking when we were growing up, the house was like filled with like corals and shells and like sand, Still is.
From Barbados, still is, nothing wrong with that. Some people have china, we have coral, and shells. But I think because of that relationship that you had with the sea, like every time we were in Barbados, because again, I think it was a very unique upbringing that I had, that we were in Barbados every single year and for long periods of time, and also quite, sometimes twice in a year, sometimes, depending what may have been happening with family. And to me, when I think of Barbados, when I am home, it has a very kind of supernatural kind of like feel for me as well. I think because so much like when you're a kid, and you can hear like the whistling frogs at night and, or you hear those mosquitoes buzzing around, everything's kind
Crickets.
of visceral, the crickets and stuff. Or like when you are in the sea and because you can see through it, the very fact that you've got visibility, you know what I mean? Especially when you can use a snorkel and stuff like that.
Yeah. Or and you can just stand up and see the fish around you.
Yeah, when it looks like glass and you can see fishes and you can see the coral and like that link, like the whole kind of the way in which you connect with something visually, and then that becomes that sensual feeling as well, like you're in the water. But then all the stories and folklore, and I'm thinking like, when Gran would tell us stories, many times I have this memory when we were in like Haynesville of sitting down while Granny's like, cleaning like the sugar cane and stuff, like peeling sugar cane. Like she would do it from the top to the bottom with a knife. I still can't do that. I don't know how she used to do that. I still can't do that. Do you know what I mean? While she's telling us these stories, but everything was, because of the backdrop that you had, it was so vivid, especially from someone that herself, I think, in my imagination, she used to be, so kind of
I think
like...
that was like a granddaughter kind of thing, because it's a bit like, if I would be talking to Joshua now about stuff that I probably wouldn't have mentioned to you all before,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that thing would be, because when you're little, you always want to hear stuff, you all want to hear stories.
Yeah.
And I think that was something that she shared with you all, because you were interested in hearing stuff,
Yeah. Because I remember her telling me like stories about David and Goliath, where she's like combing my hair at night. Yeah. But then at the same time, she'd also tell me stories about duppies and like the workers in the cave fields and stuff thinking that she was a duppy, like she was like a kind of like ghost standing there because she'd be at night like staring at them because she just liked to be out. Do you know what I mean? And like, and her laughing because she just scared these like grown men witless because they thought she was some kind of apparition, from nature.
Yeah.
And it's just like, there was always like funny kind of like movement in between like maybe, in between like the biblical and nature and then folklore and different things. So my imagination as well was just like so kind of teeming and heavy. And I think then, when we were here in the UK, and because, there could be difficult things, like when we went to see Gran, like in Sussex, when we go there and like she had this, acre of woodland or whatever, completely different world, covered in bluebells, do you know what I mean? And like, you got China from like 1750 and your feet can't touch the ground and you're eating rabbit, do you know what I mean? And it's like, it was always like, orchards and kitchen gardens and like gardener and stuff.
Formal British setting.
Very formal British setting, very formal.
The Caribbean relax.
It wasn't even relaxed, like life was just like, do you know what I mean? Like, you really like...
So a child is probably that. It's much more exaggerated because you come from this kind of background.
But also freeing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because being here, because, school was hard and you saw a lot of kids, because of race, because of a lot of things, because of, poverty in different ways, because of what was happening in people's families. And you just, as I've told you before, my memories and experience growing up in school, a lot of it, kids were just kind of fighting just to kind of survive a lot of the time. And especially a lot of children coming from black and brown communities, I had when I say I think I'm really gifted because that sense of place, that sense of identity that you had. So when someone calls you whatever names under the sun they want to call you, but you're impenetrable. Like we talk about that coat.
Grounded.
Do you know what I mean? To insulate you from the cold war. To me, like Barbados was that insulation from that kind of the kind of racism that you saw, from the way that you saw people being treated. Do you know what I mean? And how violent and also visceral that was, and how kids were kind of really kind of fighting for themselves and fighting for their families
identity.
And never in a position of power many times, you know what I mean? But to me, when those things happened, I had this entire world to draw from, and not just one that was a memory, it was a living entity, it was a being that I went to all the time, and the people were real, the places were real, the coral, the sea, the gullies, the duppies, whether it's folklore or not, these stories were real, they were me and they were our family. So they were, and then so much of that then was then just even more rooted because we were in this huge Caribbean community. So the stories just expanded. Yeah. So then you got to know
even
people.
Here in England, that Caribbean community continued through cricket because then we met more people from the Caribbean.
And then you learned more stories. You learned more stories. You bought more food. You saw more places. Like when we go to St. Vincent, and I still remember going to St. Vincent, being on a volcanic beach, looking through crystal clear glass water at black sand, and like, what is that? Very much like your ice moment, I can imagine. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So to me, it's
Even
just...
I was flabbergasted.
Well, this is it.
Yeah.
The environments and the places that people come from, what they are, I think you take those things with you, even if you're coming from a place of conflict, so many different kinds of things. You know, you root yourself in where you come from. Like there's a lot of, I was reading a lot about like a lot of black and brown communities. They have very strong relationships with nature, but they're relationships with nature that they have from the countries of origin.
Yeah.
Because that's where you've linked with nature. That's where the relationship's been developed. But it's also like where you feel safe.
Yeah.
So if your community is one that is experiencing challenges, whether it's racism, whether it's, I don't know, Islamophobia, whatever it is, you know, you don't get to choose the spaces that you feel safe in. If many times threats are coming from lots of different places, you know, so your relationship with nature in the UK may be non-existent. But when you're in Pakistan or India or Sri Lanka or Grenada or St. Lucia, it's there. And I just think that's why so much of the things we're talking about, like about climate and things are so important, because these are the things that made us us, and now they're slowly being eroded. But so the most beautiful things about us. So
I mean, at the moment we've got huge changes going on in Barbados on the west coast. I'm looking forward to going home to actually see for myself and see if I can find a bit more of what's actually happening there. There's been a lot of erosion. The beaches have changed dramatically since I was a child on those beaches. You know, we've had a deep water harbour that affected the sea quite a lot, and and the land and so on, because water has to go somewhere, and if you however you channel it, it has to go somewhere. You know, so I think and we've got at the moment the Sargasso weed is a big issue in the Caribbean. It's not just Barbados. That's at the moment. I think there's some more again I hear from Anne, and there's at the moment there's quite a bit of it on the beach again, and that's something that's happened in the last few years. Before you hardly heard about that Sargasso Sea. You know, you hadn't heard that word till I hear your dad talking about a book called The White Sargasso Sea. It had no connection to me.
It's the one that leads into Jane Eyre.
A book that he loved, And then a few years back, as it started on climate change and so on, we've noticed that you're getting more and more of this Sargasso weed, and lots of it. You know, being brought by the current from wherever it's coming from into the Atlantic Ocean and being strewn along all the Caribbean beaches. So now the big challenge now for people that deal with the environment is what can we do with this huge supply of seaweed, you know, because it's going to stay on the beach. You know, then you attract flies and blah blah. So some of the countries are looking into if there's some way they can find to use it,
harvest it. Because I know, like in Maragret, they harvest like a lot of the seaweed and things. But it's also like the plastics and things as well that you're seeing like more and more coming up and stuff as well, and like the fishing as well. Like I'm thinking of Uncle Luther, and you know, I remember like last time I was talking to him and he was telling me, and he was like, you know, Chris, like the fish are gone. I was like, what do you mean they're gone? He was like, every year I'm going further and further and further out. Now I'm miles out to sea before I'm being able to make a catch to it. Before, like, do you know what I mean? Like even like maybe 10, 15 years ago, I remember Uncle Luther like on the beach outside Sandy Lane with a bucket and a net, and I was just like, who is that man? Who is he? And I was just like, you know, that was the first time that I'd taken Nick, my husband, to Barbados, and he was just like, oh, he seems like a nice fella. I was like, yeah, that's my uncle. That's my uncle, and he's like catching little sprats.
Because when we were kids, flying fish, which is our island delicacy, you can say, flying fish. And you used to have it by the tons. There was so much of it, you know. Sometimes Mom would buy like 100 fish or whatever it is, you know. Now it's, you know, because of all the different changes and so on, fish migrate just like people. You know, if the conditions aren't right, they move, you know. And apparently they love the fish right further south. There's less people in the water because the West Coast is full of lots of boats and a lot of movement and stuff like that. So then you find that most of the fish had migrated south. You know, then fishermen had to be going south there. But then you're going into somebody else's territory when that happens and so on, you know. So at the moment they're a lot smaller, a lot more expensive, and a lot less of them.
You were talking about Barbados and you've seen the different changes there, like the flying fish, like
the sea erosion.
And different things like that. Because things like that, like it's like talking today and stuff, like kind of remembering like or channeling these stories and these experiences and things like that, and it kind of, I don't know, every time I do it, it kind of reinvests me in why it's so important to kind of like save a lot of those things, or to kind of like even just to share those kind of stories, because half the time it's like it's your experience like for your family, for your community, whether it's enjoying like the natural world or whatever, you know, whatever it is, activity or whatever it is you're doing, whether you're swimming in it, snorkeling in it, whether you're surfing or whatever it is, they like bind you to places and feelings and people. And I just like talking about Bimini in this way, and talking about the different challenges that just isn't this stunning coral island with its, you know, with its caves, and like the fact that, you know, I always remember a big memory for me was like the healing aspect of it. Like, do you remember I used to have like eczema growing up so much, and whenever I got to Barbados, you know, between like the water being filtered through the coral system of this island, and then also with the sea, you know, it would all disappear. And you know, it was just like, you know, within 3 days, like the island kind of healed you of any kind of like ailments that you had, and like the health and things of that. And I just think like, do you think like, does it worry you when you see the things that are happening to Barbados? Do you think like, because to me like so much of it is in kind of investing now, you know, we're talking about your grandchildren, you talk about marchards and stuff, you know.
Not that it worries me, but being here in this country, and because there's so much information right now at the moment, and because the environment is such a high profile subject at the moment, of course you've been learning a lot more things. And before that you go home and you will see stuff, but it didn't really resonate because there wasn't anything you could do about it, and you just observe and see, but you know, it wasn't on the agenda, you know. Some years back, you know. And the last time I went home, many times when I went home, and if you're walking on the East Coast, you would see stuff sometimes along the beach. Nobody bathes there because Barbadians don't go in the water along that East Coast at all. And I would always wonder, where's this stuff come from? You know, not loads of it, but you see the odd plastic thing or rope or, you know, different things. And always wonder, you can't see anything on the surface of the water, but obviously it's been brought there. And the last time I was home, I went again along the coast, a different part of the East Coast. And there was so much, there was a lot of plastic that we wash up. And I know it's not anywhere that Barbadians go, but they got specific places where they go to picnic and stuff. And I thought this stuff must have come off the ocean in some way. And from then, and listening to all the environmental thing and the big thing they have in Scotland, everybody's talking about the environment and the plastic in the ocean. That sort of brought it back to me. You know, saying this is a worldwide issue. It is happening to us because we're getting some rubbish as well, and obviously it's happening on TV. You could say it happening to lots of other places that people are not living. You're finding stuff washing up on the beach. So that has made me think that when I go home, I will go back to that particular place I went to. I have a look and see if the situation is the same, if this is still happening, and actually do something about it. I would, you know, walk with bags or whatever it is. And I feel now stronger. Before I might see something on the beach and just walk past it. Now, for me now, it's important that I take it with me, get it off the beach, you know.
Yeah.
You know,
And I think this is one of the things as well, for me, when you start, you know, even just the things that we've been talking about, we've talked about coastal erosion, we've talked about, you know, the reefs, like the corals and stuff breaking off, which you don't even see anymore. Like a lot of them have been like really devastated. There's diseases that are going through the coral reefs and stuff across the Caribbean. You're thinking of like the way in which now like the pandemic has kind of made a lot of people link to nature all over the world.
Yes,
But at the same time, so many times, you know, for someone that is traveling and seeing someplace that's a tourist, they're there for 2 weeks and they leave this paradise that they've paid all this money to go see. But there's people that are living in these places that are affected by what you do. And I think sometimes as well, like there's a bit of a kind of isolationist kind of way about things. Like people think, oh, you know, like, you know, even sometimes when people think about things being sustainable, oh, you know, I've just bought local or I'm doing it here or, you know, and it becomes this very much kind of a voice and a thought and things that can be very much only where you are. And you forget about the wider kind of relationship and the ecology that not only has affected like, or how it affects other countries, but the history of how long things have been done, that those countries have been affected.
It didn't just happen, it's happened over, you know, long periods of time,
like,
centuries and centuries.
Like when I think of Barbados, like the reason we have plantations, you know, because of the empire, because of all these kind of things, like that's the clearance of so much of like the natural environment, the biodiversity loss, like the Caribbean monk seal being like hunted to extinction because its blubber was used for the plantations. You know, like it's not just like the way in which like people, whether we're looking at enslavement or different things, were affected within the Caribbean and the history of it. That history is also an environmental history because of its impact of what's happened to communities there, like the power that you've had to do things about it that for so long you didn't, especially if you're like someone who was, black and Barbadian or brown and Barbadian, although, you don't really have mixed race people in that kind of context, in Barbados. But I just think the history of the Caribbean in that context is an environmental history as well. And many countries like the UK or France or Portugal or lots of different places have profited from them, but I've also contributed to a lot of the things that are there, and now we're still trying to figure out how to do it.
Back into helping to deal with the problems that we've inherited that they created in the first place.
Well,
like sugar, for example. Once sugar was not important anymore, people they weren't interested in sugar, or they had beetroot as a substitute for sugar, which was cheaper, and they didn't need all the back-breaking labor to deal with it. But the ground has had centuries of being used with one monoculture, and that depletes the soil because the soil is coral, so it's not deep. Our soil is very shallow. So
it's just
once
depleted,
that is
isn't
gone
it?
And sugar is not the optimal now, what do you do with the land? What else can you grow there when the soil is depleted and haven't got all the normal minerals and stuff that would have had before it was denuded? You know what I mean? It's okay to say, okay, we're not buying sugar from you anymore, but what are the people supposed to do? You need to have an income. They're not going to suddenly go and start, the agricultural and growing everything, because you have to plan these things, It doesn't work like that. And that's all through the Caribbean, because a lot of plantations, or whether sugar cane or coconuts or bananas, again, monocultures. And if anything happened to any of these products, then you have a big issue. Because you're depending on one particular thing. Like now, for us now, it's tourism, so if anything happens major, then it impacts on us, because that's where we get most of our revenue from now. That sugar is not.
But that's so interesting about tourism, especially someone like Barbados that's so dependent on it, because it's the very natural environment that
brings the people.
Is Barbados that we've been talking about, that brings so many people, and especially because of that marine environment, why it's so important to protect it and look after it and to do what we can do to
teach people about it, because the big
absolutely
you can't protect something if you don't know that it needs protected. And a lot of people are too busy trying to survive and live their lives.
Absolutely.
And the sea and what's in it is the furthest thing from their minds, because a lot of people just have a natural fear of the sea, of the ocean, and so on. But people still need to be educated about it. If you are told that, you don't want rubbish on the beach, if you go on a picnic, you take your rubbish back home with you, or if you're walking along the beach and you see something, pick it up, put it in a bag or something, you know what I mean? Teach people how to look after the environment and to become part of it. They're teaching the children in school now, so when they come up, they would know how to help look after the island in the future. But you need to teach everybody, not just the young.
Because I think that last thing, when we were growing up, I think so much of faith and religion and spirituality had to do with the environment, because I think Gran was so much she had her Gran in Barbados, she had her kitchen garden making her seasonings and different things, and so much of the earth, the nature. Gran always used to tell me, it's you have nothing to be scared of when it comes to nature. It's humans that you have to be careful of. This is to her it was intrinsic, nature and God were one in that many cases. And then when I think of Uncle Pecky and Uncle Herman, in the Rastafari tradition, that's veganism. Do you know what I mean? Again, growing their own food and different things, and the whole practice of how the environment linked to their spirituality. So in both ways, it was just such a strong link between spirituality, the environment, the human condition, and what it was there.
It's all connected.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Each depends on each other to keep going, to survive. If anything breaks in that link, everything suffers.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for talking about it, Mom.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Your brain's like a vault. I unlock it and share it with everyone. Yesterday we were at Tilbury Dock, and we started our journey there. One, because of, I think it's a point one in terms of the Windrush generation, but I think a lot of it as well is that growing up in that community, in the London Caribbean community, and Mum as well, I've grown up with these stories and the stories of the elders in our community, and I can see their faces, and I can see their faces, and the stories that I've heard over the years, but also, which I think was quite poignant that Mum brought up, is that for some, as Mum likened it, she said it's like, you know, it was like the war, like as in like World War II or World War One, where they don't talk about it because the experiences they had were so traumatic they are not shared. So
well, yesterday when we started, for me personally, because I only heard about the Windrush after all this stuff blew up in the press. Before that, I heard nothing about the Windrush. I knew nothing about Windrush per se. And so yesterday when we were going to start there, I thought it was quite poignant because I wanted to see where these people came into Britain. I had no idea where where Tilbury docks was like. In my imagination, it was somewhere near London because I could imagine that you were going to be so far trying to get into London when you came here on a boat, you know, your mother's from anywhere. So I wanted to see where they started. So yes, that was the first time I got to see that, and I went through that tunnel where they've got all the pictures and stuff, and so the kids that came here in the 50s and all that sort of stuff. So that was quite poignant. So I thought this was the start of their journey started from the Caribbean, but here in Britain, this was the start of their journey, whether you were a baby or youngster or adult. For myself personally, I came here much later, and a lot of the initial sufferings and stuff were in a different place. I'm married in Barbados and I came here, so I did not go through the educational system here. So I came here, I married an Englishman in Barbados and came here. So my experience was slightly different to a lot of other persons. And I was looking down, all I can see is white. And I'm thinking, why is the ground white? I can't understand it. You know, and I couldn't think what it was. Because when we were at home in Maragret, what we used to do when you hear about cold things, we would like put our head in the freezer and see, is this was any cold? Because your imagination just cannot grasp it, which was ridiculous because all the rest of your body was hot energy. You know when you're a kid, you do kind of crazy stuff.
So imagine what it's like to be British, just to put your head in
I watch pictures of stuff on TV and you imagine, you just can't imagine ice coming out from the sky. This is just not, stuff. But, I had sisters that weren't interested whatsoever and didn't care about it. And then I had other sisters that we went to see all the time together. It was a big part, But for me, I think somehow I had a stronger connection. When I came here, one of the first things I said to my husband is that, where's the sea? He says the nearest ocean, Margaret, is 50 miles from here, from London. I said, okay. I said, so can we go sometime? So the first place I saw was Brighton. And I was like, wow, there's rocks on the beach. Where's the sand? Because I hope the sun is blinding sometimes, you know what I mean? Wow. I remember even the first time my dad came here and he just looked and it's like, wow, this is something you can't in your imagination think
I don't even think Granddad, I think he took 2 steps back and was just like, I don't think so. This is like Granddad, yeah. And then somebody mentioned to me about Maragret, and I think the first time I met Maragret, Chris was quite small, maybe about 2 or something like that. Yeah. And so we took the train, because at the time it wasn't driving me and my other best friend from Barbados. We took the train and found our way to Maragret. Yeah. Right, okay, we've got sand! It's not white sand, but it's sand. Yeah. And from then I would take them, we would come to Maragret and so on.
We always say that actually, when people ask us why are we starting the People Them Collective in Maragret, and other than the black experience, it's not just the urban one, but also as black and brown people, being near the ocean and in nature is much more natural to us. You just said about your relationship with the environment and where you live at the Caribbean, you're near the ocean, whether you're scared to go in the sea or not.
You can't go in there and see the sea. Yeah,
brings up every 12 hours in the tide. And I think that those stories are not told so much about the Caribbean's relationship with the ocean and the environment. Of course they're not. And there's such a beautiful story that, like you said, we have to tell.
We
have to tell these stories.
Because I think, speaking with Uncle Luther, I remember Uncle Luther's a fisherman, can't swim. Do you know what I mean? But this idea of
even in this country, a lot of fishing people can't swim.
No, it is that. But it's also you talk to Uncle Luther. It's like my mum was saying. The fear of the sea is because I think it's almost. I think you've got to think of it in a spiritual sense. Yeah, the sea is an absolute entity. So to Uncle Luther, when he's talking to me, it's what's the point of swimming? This is a living sea god. This is a spirit. If it's going to take me, it's going to take me. I have no choice over that. So it's incredibly, incredibly huge kind of spiritual kind of in that kind of way of this being an entity, that it has this kind of like, this kind of chaos and harmony, and this is what provides for you. It doesn't, exactly. And so this is what I'm going to show you. So we learned about like the plantations, like Farley Hill Plantation, where the last our family came from, in terms of like, and the stories that we have, and you know, from when our ancestors were enslaved, and then when they managed to exit that out of their own self-determination. Do you know what I mean? Just before the abolition, and even when you think of the abolition of enslavement, you know. We have this book that was published in like 1848. It's like this history of Barbados, and it's an incredible document. We've been to a lot of times because it talks about the natural history of Barbados, and it uses a lot of the terms that local people use. But within it, like, it's interesting because it documents that time, and they refer to, like, for example, people that are just supposed to be exiting enslavement as being lazy. They talk about how it's affected their exports. You know what I mean? How, you know, the sugarcane, tobacco, all these things are going down. Like, oh, they don't work. You know, they're not as diligent and they work as they used to be when they were enslaved. Like, just straight out. You know, and talking about how they refuse to go back to the plantations, that they want their own land and things. And now that the ones that have found more, you know, that have managed to identify and have more money, they're enabling the other ones. So they're having less and less people like then returning to plantations to work. And obviously, you know, there ain't no minimum pay. So you can imagine what that was like. So Barbados, talking about going really into apartheid systems. Do you know what I mean? After the abolition, I think there's so many myths in that of what that really means, like, for a lot of people. And I think what that still means, you know, like, the tourism, it's huge, and it's one of the biggest assets in Barbados in terms of the economy, for good reason, because, like, you know, it's not like Trinidad and other places where you've got, like, you know, you've got mining, you've got natural resources that you extract, for better or worse, how that's been done. So that tourism is what is enabling a lot of people to feed themselves. But, you know, the very beaches themselves that you talk about, like, you used to have, like, calypsonians, like the Mighty Gabby, and there was this song, Jack, and it was just, like, this kind of colloquial term for, you know, like, Englishmen, and it was like, because people were still trying to keep people off the beaches, like black Bajans off the beaches, and that's still, like, segregation is, I think, is still very much there in terms, you don't see the mixing, like, in terms of white Bajans and black Bajans. It's very separated in that way. So, like, you know, Gabby as a calypsonian was, like, really political, hardcore kind of figure. So I'm trying to remember how the song goes. He would, like, Jack, don't want me to bathe on my beach. Jack, want me to stay out of reach. Jack,
Because when they buy properties, they want to include parts of the beach. And in the Constitution of Barbados, nobody owns the beach. The beach is for Bajans. Yeah.
But, and again, I think coming back to Mum's point in terms of our education, Mum also talked to us and showed us, like, for example, the indigenous communities and societies that were there long before we even had, you know, the whole kind of, even anything like the beginning of the colonial histories in the 17th century. So you're aware of the Taino communities, or the Carib communities, of how they go all across the Caribbean. And like St. Vincent, you know, you have communities there where you have the Carib, for example, communities, you have Creole, and you had, like, people that had, Africans that had escaped enslavement and stuff, and they came together as, like, entire communities. And they fought back with the British to have their own territories. And it's like, so it's not even the segregation of these different communities, but then how they came together, and people that were shipwrecked, like, enslaved people that were taking to, like, the plantations, they would try and get to St. Vincent because you knew you'd have half a chance. Do you know what I mean? But when I was growing up, I didn't share with her how racist school was, how...
School here?
It's all right.
I don't know if I'm getting too
No, because we're there.
This is an emotion you're expressing.
Exactly, and it's a safe space because we know it. We're not reading it or guessing it. We know it.
Yeah, you experience it. Yeah.
Mm.
I didn't go to school here, so I have no idea the kind of things that, you know.
But you know, it was like. But you know, like when I was in school, like even primary school, and the kids there, they would fight like men, like, because that's what they were doing. They fought so hard. You know, I would see that. I remember these two albino twins, these two boys, and they were just fighting all the time. But the things that people would call you, do you know what I mean? I remember like getting surrounded, being called names and stuff like that. And these are the same people you have to go into class with day after day and stuff. And you know, I remember the first time I said it. You know, I mentioned it wrong because I thought I was older, but Mum said it was about 5 or 6 because the first time I asked her about the term like half caste, and I thought it meant like you were half made because of the way in which, you know, it was like kind of screamed at you and different things, and it was all like we were always kind of fighting for that kind of survival, and it was all the way like secondary school, you know, college. I'd say like the most racist times actually were probably like when I was in primary school and then when I was at university, because
especially that was the first time I really saw like really affluent people where university didn't matter for them, in the sense that it was like a cultural kind of rite of passage, but their parents had them set up, you know, they bought them a house for them to be there for 3 years, that they'd flip, and like I hadn't seen affluence like that, especially coming from the communities I had. And you know, when I was at art school, like, you know, I'd ask them, I was like, I understand like everything's just European or American, like where
It's
you
not
know,
American, it's all European.
yeah, well, sorry, that is, no, you're right. And I was like, when am I going to learn about, I know that these other kind of cultures and things exist. And then just straight, I was like, no, we don't teach that. If you want to find that out, you have to do it for yourself. And what was the story I'd always known. But with Mum's voice, I think it's a spectacular one. But I think with so many of our elders, I just don't hear those voices enough. And I think so many times, it's like, our elders are our ancestors and making in the present that are already here. Do you know what I mean? That you're learning from. And, you know, with Mum, and when I was growing up, because Mum had to leave school, you know, quite early to support the family and stuff, like when I did my masters and things like in post-colonial studies, I shared everything with Mum. Shared all my papers with her, all my essays and stuff, because we educated each other. And she would come back with like her kind of observations and things, and it made the work like so much deeper. And I've never stopped that practice with Mum, because she always educated me, and now it's a cycle, like we share that, you know, it's an intergenerational cycle. So even with things like this, I'm like, you know, I don't just want to hear your voice because like you're my mum. I want to hear your voice because it's just wisdom. I found that so much with here in the way in which this is practiced, and they care of it. Do you know what I mean?
And it's people wanting to hear stuff, because a lot of things, elderly people got a lot to give, but very few people really want to hear or ask them questions. That's the problem. It's not that they don't want to contribute, but you have to ask somebody something or show an interest.
And you've got to create that environment for that to happen.
Yeah.